Well, welcome to another edition of Traveling Through History. Today, we are going to take a look at one of the greats of all time, the great conqueror, emperor, king, military general, and true legend in his own time and ever since, and that is Alexander the Great, Alexander of Macedon. And if you think about the impact he had on civilization, both in Europe, in the Middle East, and all the way to Asia, the impact truly reverberated and still does even today. The number of countries and civilizations that he conquered during his time on behalf of the very small province of Macedonia, which was part of Greece at the time. It's actually the smallest city state of all of them. And somehow this man comes out of his father's court, his father being Philip II, the king of Macedonia, and takes this very small kingdom across essentially the entire known world at the time. And so we're going to take a look at Alexander, his history, his early life, his military entry at 18 years old, and then all the way through his entire career of conquering the known world at the time until his unfortunate passing at 33 years old, a very young man. So the impact he had from 18 to 33 was truly remarkable and really made its mark on world history, as you'll see. So we're going to take a look at his entire history. Then we're going to look at a video. We're going to look at the 20 interesting facts about Alexander the Great. And then we're also going to take a look at a quick look at the great film that came out 14 years ago called Alexander. And it had Colin Farrell and Angelina Jolie and a lot of really good actors in it. So we'll take a quick look at the clip of that movie as well. So let's go ahead and talk about the history of Alexander the Great. Alexander III of Macedon, better known as Alexander the Great, was born in July 356 BCE and died in June of 323 BCE at 33 years old. He was born son of the king Philip II of Macedon, who became king under his father's death in 336 BC, and then conquered most of the known world today, as we said. He is known as the Great both for his military genius and his diplomatic skills in handling the various populaces of the regions he conquered all around the world. He is further recognized for spreading Greek culture, language, and thought from Greece throughout Asia Minor, Egypt, Mesopotamia, all the way to India and on the border of China, and thus initiating the era of the Hellenistic period, which was from 323 to 31 BCE, essentially 300 years of the Hellenistic culture being spread across the entire world, during which four of his generals, or his successors, known as his THy&x, in between their wars for supremacy, continued his policies integrating Greek Hellenistic culture with that of the Near East. He died of unknown causes in 323 BCE without clearly naming a successor. And the empire he built was divided among the THy&x, or his four main generals. Alexander's campaigns became legendary after his death, influencing the tactics and careers of later Greek and Roman generals, as well as inspiring numerous biographies attributing to him godlike status. Modern-day historians have generally taken a more critical approach of his life and career than other accounts, as evidenced by the criticism of his destruction of Persepolis and treatment of citizens of Tyre. But the general consensus regarding his legacy among Western scholars remains largely positive, and he remains one of the most popular and recognizable figures in world history. In terms of his youth, when Alexander was young, he was taught to fight and ride by Leonidas of Epirus, who was a relative of his mother Olympias, as well as to endure hardships such as forced marches. His father Philip was interested in cultivating a refined future king, so he hired Lysimachus of Acarnania to teach the boy reading, writing, and to play the lyre. This tutelage would install in Alexander a lifetime love of reading and music. At the age of 13, Alexander was introduced to Greek philosopher Aristotle, whom Philip hired as a private tutor to the boy. He would study with Aristotle until he was 16. The two were said to have remained in correspondence through Alexander's later campaigns, although evidence was anecdotal at the time. Aristotle's influence directly bore upon Alexander's later dealings with the people he conquered, in that Alexander never forced the culture of Greece upon inhabitants of the various regions, but merely introduced it to them in the same way Aristotle used to teach his students. The influence of Leonidas may be seen in Alexander's lifelong resilience and physical stamina, as well as his skill with horses. Alexander is said to have tamed the untamable Bacephalus when he was 11 or 12 years old. This was essentially a very large horse that nobody else could tame, and he did when he was 11 or 12 years old. When his various tutors' influences certainly had a profound effect on him, Alexander seemed destined for greatness from birth. He had, first of all, a father whose accomplishments laid a firm foundation for his later success. The historian Diodorus Siculus observes, during the 24 years of his reign as king of Macedonia, in which he started with the slenderest of resources, Philip built his own kingdom up into the greatest power in Europe. His projected overthrow of the Persian Empire landed forces in Asia and was the act of liberating the Hellenistic communities when he was interrupted by fate, in spite of which he bequeathed a military establishment of such size and quality that his son Alexander was enabled to overthrow the Persian Empire without requiring the assistance of any allies. These achievements were not the work of fortune, but of his own force of character. For this king stands out above all others for his military acumen, his personal courage, his intellectual brilliance, and his tactics. While it's clear that his father had this impact on him, Alexander himself chose to see his success as ordained by divine forces. He called himself the son of Zeus, and so claimed the status of a demigod, linking his bloodline to his two favorite heroes of antiquity, Achilles and Hercules, and modeling his behavior after theirs. The belief of his divinity was instilled in him by Olympia, his mother, who also told him that his virgin birth, as she had been miraculously impregnated by Zeus himself. His birth was associated with the great signs and wonders, such as bright star gleaming over Macedonia the night and the destruction of the temple of Artemis at Ephesus. Plutarch writes, Alexander was born the 6th of Hectorian, which month the Macedonians called Luas, the same day that the temple of Diana at Ephesus was burnt, which Hyginus of Magnesia makes the occasion of conceit, frigid enough to have stopped the conflagration. The temple, he says, took fire and was burnt while its mistress was absent, assisting at the birth of Alexander, and all the Eastern soothsayers who happened to then be in Ephesus, looking upon the ruin of this temple to be the forerunner of something that was coming as a calamity, ran about town, beating their faces and crying that this day had brought forth something that could prove fatal and destructive to all of Asia. Through his birth, it's well documented by historians that little information on his youth aside from the tales of his precociousness. He allegedly interviewed visiting dignitaries about the boundaries and strengths of Persia when he was 7 years old. His tutors and his childhood friends also contributed to these interviews. Alexander's friends, Cassander of Ptolemy and Hephaestion, would become his lifelong companions and generals in his army. Cathesians, another friend, was Aristotle's great nephew and came to the Macedonian court with a philosopher. He would become court historian and follow Alexander on all of his campaigns. Hephaestion remained the best and dearest friend throughout his entire life and second in command of the army. Of Alexander's youth, the historian Worthington writes that Alexander would have been educated at home, as was the custom in Macedonia. We become used to seeing and then participating in the drinking contests that were part of Macedonian court life, but that aside from that, we know surprisingly little about Alexander's boyhood. Alexander's military prowess was first noted at the Battle of Charnia in 338 BCE. Although only 18 years old, he helped turn the tide of the battle in a decisive Macedonian victory, which defeated the Greek allied city-states. When Philip II was assassinated in 336 BCE, Alexander assumed the throne, and with the Greek city-states now united under Macedonian rule following Charnia, embarked on a great campaign his father had been planning but never got to execute, and that was the conquest of the mighty Persian Empire. Worthington writes, Homer was Alexander's Bible, and he took Aristotle's edition with him to Asia. During his campaigns, Alexander was always intent on finding out everything he could about the areas through which he passed. He took with him an entourage of scientists to record and analyze this information, from botany to biology to zoology to meteorology to topography. His desire to learn and to have information recorded as scientifically as possible probably stemmed from Aristotle's teachings and enthusiasm in 34 and 35. With a Macedonian army of 32,000 infantry and 5,100 cavalry, Alexander crossed over into Asia Minor in 334 BCE to begin his conquest of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, defeating the Persian army led by in the Battle of Granicus in May of that year. He then liberated, as phrased in his conquest, the cities of Sardis and Ephesus from Persian rule that same year before moving on to other areas of Asia Minor. At Ephesus, he offered to rebuild the temple of Artemis, which had been destroyed by arson on the night of his birth, but the city refused this gesture. In 333 BCE, Alexander and his troops defeated the larger force of King Darius III of Persia at the Battle of Issos. This was the most famous battle in his military career at a very young age. Alexander went on to sack the Phoenician cities of Balak and Sidon in 332 BCE and then lay siege to the island city of Tyre. So determined was he to conquer the ancient city of Tyre that he built a causeway from the mainland to the island on which to mount his siege engines, his horses, and his men. The causeway in time collected silt and earth and is the reason why Tyre is a part of the mainland of Lebanon even today. For their stubborn resistance, the inhabitants of the city were slaughtered and the survivors sold into slavery. His policy regarding citizens of Tyre is cited by historians, ancient and modern, as the prime example of his ruthlessness. In 331 BCE, he conquered Egypt, where he founded the city of Alexandria in his name. At the Oracle of Siwa, in the eponymous Egyptian oasis, he was proclaimed the son of the god Zeus Ammon. Though he had conquered Egypt, Alexander was not interested in imposing his own ideas of truth or religion or behavior upon the people, as long as they willingly kept the supply lines open to feed and equip his troops. Every aspect of his ability to rule vast areas was to be neglected by his successors. However, he was in full control, both militarily and politically. This does not mean, however, that he would not ruthlessly suppress uprisings or hesitate to viciously annihilate those who opposed him. After designing the plan for the city of Alexandria, he left Egypt for Syria and modern Mesopotamia to further campaigns against Persia. So you can see this is one thing that Alexander really believed in. He wanted to be the greatest conqueror of all time, and he ended up being so. He conquered the most territory, the most countries, the most cultures in human history. In terms of those Persian campaigns, which were his father's objective, he never got to execute. In 331 BCE, Alexander met Darius III again on the battlefield. This was the second time in Gaugamela, which is also called the Battle of Arbela, where once again, facing overwhelming numbers, he was outnumbered 4-1 in this battle against Darius. He decisively defeated Darius III again, who fled the field on his chariot. Alexander then moved on to take Babylon and Susa, which surrendered unconditionally to him without any resistance and laid down their arms. In the winter of 330, Alexander marched towards Persepolis, meeting resistance at the Battle of Persian Gates, defended by the hero Artabarzans and his sister Utab at the head of the Persian troops. Alexander defeated this force and then took Persepolis, which he then burned to the ground. According to the ancient historian Diodorus and other ancient sources, he started the fire which destroyed the main palace and most of the city as a revenge for burning the Acropolis in Xerxes' Persian invasion of Greece in 480 BC. So you can see he was aware of the Xerxes invasion of Greece, and he did this revenge on behalf of the Greek people. This act was said to be instigated during a drunken party by Thais, the Athenian lover of the general Ptolemy, claiming it would be apt revenge for the city to be burnt by women's hands. and she is to have thrown her torch right after Alexander first threw his torch onto the pyre. In the summer of 330 BCE, Darius III was assassinated by his own generals and cousin Besus in an act Alexander was said to deplore. He was not a big fan of this move. He believed that Darius, although he did defeat him twice, deserved better. Darius III's corpse was treated with the greatest respect, as were the survivors of the members of his family. Alexander proclaimed himself the king of Asia and continued on with his conquests, marching into the region of modern-day Afghanistan. In 329 BCE, he founded the city of Alexandria Eschate on the Xerxes River, destroyed the city of Cryopolis, and defeated the Scythians in the northern borders of the empire. Between the fall of 330 BCE and spring of 327 BCE, he campaigned against Bactria and Sogdiana, hard-fought battles in which he won every single engagement thus far. So if you think about it, to this point, in his 20s, he was undefeated. He had a record of 38-0 in his major battles. Besus was captured and executed for his treachery against his former king to send the message that disloyalty of any kind in this new empire would never be rewarded. Alexander founded many cities bearing his name during this time to further his public image, not only as liberator, but as a demigod, and adopted the title Shaganash, or King of Kings, used by the rulers in the First Persian Empire. In keeping with his status, Alexander introduced the Persian custom of proskyneus to the army, forcing those to address him first to kneel and then to kiss his hand. The Macedonian troops became progressively uncomfortable with Alexander's apparent deification and adoption of Persian customs. Assassination plots were hatched behind the scenes, only to be revealed and conspirators then executed to protect Alexander, even if they were old friends in some cases. Callisthenes became one of those when he was implicated in a plot. Cletus, the elder statesman who had saved Alexander's life at the Battle of Granicus, would doom himself in a similar way. In 327 BCE, Alexander would depose of both Castellius and Cletus in separate incidents. Alexander's habit of drinking to excess was well known, and certainly in the case of Cletus's death significantly influenced the murder. Both Cletus and Callisthenes had become quite vocal in their criticism of Alexander's adoption of Persian customs. Though capable of great diplomacy and skill in dealing with conquered peoples and their rulers, Alexander was not known for tolerating personal opinions which conflicted with his own, and this intolerance was exacerbated by his drinking. Cletus's death was swift through a javelin Alexander hurled at him, while Callisthenes was imprisoned and died in confinement after 3 years. In 327 BCE, with the Persian Empire firmly under his control and newly married to the Bactrian noblewoman Roxana, Alexander turned his attention to India. Having heard the exploits of the great Macedonian general, the Indian king Amphius of Taxila submitted to his authority without a fight. But the Aspanari and Askarni tribes strongly resisted Alexander. In battles throughout 327 and 326, Alexander subdued these tribes, finally meeting King Porus of Parvarnia at the Battle of Hydrasops River in 326. Porus charged Alexander's forces with elephants and fought so bravely with his troops that after defeating Porus, Alexander installed him as ruler of the larger region than he had previously held. Alexander's horse, Bucephalus, was killed in the battle, and Alexander named one of the 2 cities he founded after the battle, Bucephalia, after his horse. It's really interesting that he had so much respect for Porus, the Indian king, and how he fought, that he installed him as governor of the area in his kingdom. Alexander intended to march on and cross the river Ganges towards further conquest, but his troops, worn out by the hard-fought battles with Porus and others, refused to cross the river and said that they had gone as far as they were going to go. So you have to imagine, out of the original 30,000 plus troops he had taken out of Macedonia, plus the additional riders of his cavalry, they had been through 10 years of war at this point. and they were completely exhausted, wanted to see their families, had gotten to the edge of India, almost into China, and now had refused to go on. The mutiny occurred in late 326 BCE, and Alexander tried to persuade his men to press on, but failing to win them over, finally assented to their wishes and turned around. He split his army in two, sending half back to Susa by sea under the command of Admiral Nearchares through the Persian Gulf, and marched the other half through the Gadorian Desert in 325 BCE, almost a full year after his troops had mutinied. So you can see what he did was he did turn around at their request. He sent half of them home by sea, half of them he marched on land through his empire. Even though he had abandoned his conquest of the rest of India and China, he still paused in his march to subdue those hostile tribes he encountered along the way. The harsh terrain of the desert and the military engagements took a great toll on his troops, and by the time they reached Susa in 324 BCE, a full year later, Alexander had sustained critical and considerable losses to his troops. Upon his return, he found that many of the satraps he had entrusted with rule had abused their power and so executed them well as those who vandalized the tomb of Cyrus the Great. He ordered the great capital and the tomb to be restored and took other measures to integrate his army with the people of the region and merge the cultures of Persia and Macedonia into one culture. Alexander held mass marriage service at Susa in 324, at which he married members of his senior staff to Persian princesses and noblewomen, while he himself married a daughter of Darius III to further identify himself with Persian royalty. Many of his troops objected to this cultural merger and increasingly criticized his adoption of Persian dress and manners, which he effected since 329 BCE. They further objected to the promotion of Persians over Macedonians in the army and to Alexander's order merging Persian and Macedonian units. Alexander responded by appointing Persians to prominent positions in the army and awarded traditional Macedonian titles and honors to the Persian units. His troops backed down and submitted to Alexander's wishes, and in the gesture of goodwill, he returned the titles of the Macedonians and ordered the great command feast, at which he dined and drank with the army. He had already dropped the custom of Procinius in defiance to his men, but continued to comport himself as a Persian rather than as a Macedonian king. About this time in 324 BCE, his lifelong friend, his second in command, Hephaestion, died from fever, although some suggest that he may have been poisoned. Plutarch claims that Alexander slaughtered the Cassinians of neighboring town as a sacrifice to his friend. And Arrian writes that he had Hephaestion's doctor executed for failing to cure him. The manes and tails of the horses were cut as a sign of mourning, and Alexander refused to promote another Hephaestion position to the commander of the cavalry. He abstained from food and drink and declared a period of mourning throughout his empire, and funeral rites usually reserved for a king were for his best friend. While still processing the grief of his friend's death, Alexander returned to Babylon in 323 BCE with plans to expand his empire, but he would never realize them. He died at Babylon at the age of 32 years old, almost 33, on June 11th, 323 BCE, after suffering 10 days of high fever. Theories concerning the cause of Alexander's death have ranged from poisoning to malaria to meningitis or bacterial infection from drinking contaminated water. Plutarch says that 14 days before his death, Alexander entertained his fleet admiral Necarius and friend Medius of Larissa with a long bout of drinking, after which he fell into a fever from which he never recovered. When he was asked who should succeed him, Alexander said, "The strongest," which answer led to the empire being divided among four of his generals, Cassander, Ptolemy, Agonius, and Seleucus, also known as Diakai for his successors. So you can see he was so great and so powerful, and his empire had stretched through so many different cultures and countries that to divide up his empire took four men to lead it and to actually keep charge of it. Plutarch and Arrian, however, claim he passed his reign to Perdiccas, the friend of Hephaestion, who which Alexander had carried their friend's body to the funeral in Babylon. Perdiccas, also Alexander's friend as well as his bodyguard and fellow cavalryman, It would make sense considering Alexander's habit of rewarding those he was close with and who was very loyal, and he would choose Perdiccas over others. However, that may be, following Alexander's death, the four generals ignored these wishes, and Perdiccas was actually assassinated in 321 BCE. As you can see, Alexander came to an end very early in his life, almost 33 years old. He had had a very short time on this earth. He had a very short time as ruler, but you can see the amount of impact he had all the way from Europe through the Middle East, all the way through Asia, through India, and to the border of China. And the amount of impact he had had culturally, the amount of impact he had had across so many different cultures, moving them together. The languages had changed, the cultures had changed, the economics of his empire had changed. He had merged many, many different peoples and ways of living, and his impact would continue on for many, many centuries after this. The Alexander or Hellenistic culture would continue on for centuries and centuries after his death, which was untimely and at a very early age. Who knows what would have happened if Alexander had lived beyond his 33 years and continued to expand his empire? Would have been very interesting to watch. So let's go ahead and take a look at a quick video about Alexander the Great and his life.
Macedonia, 357 BC. The Kingdom of Macedonia consolidated itself, day by day, as the greatest military power in the European continent. Under the leadership of Philip II of Macedon, an empire was gaining shape. The Macedonian king had just married the beautiful Olympias, a member of the royal family of Epirus. The young King Philip had established himself solidly in the always unstable Macedonian throne. A large part of his predecessors had been murdered during the endless power struggles. Despite his firm position on the throne, Philip did not have an heir, and so he spared no efforts to conceive a child together with his new wife. Olympias was a woman with very eccentric habits for the Macedonians at the time, and a worshipper of religions and exotic rituals such as the cult of Dionysus. One night, Olympias had a dream in which Zeus threw one of his powerful lightning bolts against her belly. In another night, Philip caught his wife naked, curled, and exchanging caresses with a huge serpent. They say that, on that night, the queen received the visit of Zeus himself, who entered in her room disguised as a serpent. He seduced the queen and impregnated her. After accomplishing the mission of impregnating his wife, Philip decided that it was time to expand his territories and went to war. Months passed, and Philip kept his war efforts alive. The king was sieging the city of Potidaea. On that day, 3 messengers arrived from different origins with important messages to the king. Coming from Thrace, the first messenger informed that the Macedonian general Parmenion had attained a decisive victory over the Illyrians. Coming from the city of Olympia, the second messenger reported that the king's horse had been the winner of the Olympic Games. The third messenger was from Pella, the capital of the Macedonian Empire, and brought the news that Olympias had given birth and the child was a male. With this 3 news, the king was overwhelmed with happiness and ordered the organization of a great festivity to celebrate the events. The child was born on a summer evening, and on the same day, far from there in Ephesus, the great temple dedicated to the goddess Artemis, considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, burned down in flames. No one knows for sure the reason of the fire, but they say that the temple burned down because the goddess Artemis had departed to Pella to watch the birth of a child who would dominate the known world. The name of this child was Alexander. The tiny Alexander, son of King Philip II of Macedon, with the Queen Olympias of Epirus, was a descendant of a lineage even nobler than what it appeared to be. His father's family was a descendant of the famous mythological hero Hercules, and on the mother's side, he had in his veins the blood of Achilles, the great hero of the Iliad. Nothing less than a glorious future was expected for this child, heir to the throne of Macedonia. The beginning of his childhood was not very different from any noble child of that time. But the watchful gaze of Queen Olympias did not miss a single movement of the boy. The mother and son bond was quite strong, but despite all the affection and care she gave to her son, Olympia avoided to spoil the child too much, guaranteeing that he would not become a soft and spineless adult. The presence of Alexander's father was seldom seen, since the king was constantly absent, expanding his empire. Soon after Alexander's birth, Philip went with his army to a military incursion. He was wounded and ended up blind in one eye. People said that the wound was a punishment of Zeus, who punished the king for having spied the union between serpent-shaped Zeus with Queen Olympias. Albeit absent, whenever he returned home, Philip spent part of his time with his son and taught him things he deemed crucial for the upbringing of a great king and general. Alexander spent the days together with the children, offspring of the highest Macedonian noble lineage, with whom he created bonds of friendship and trust that would last until his death. Among them was Hephaestion, who would become an inseparable friend of Alexander. These young children were educated by Leonidas. The tutor and their adjutants taught martial arts, music, and poetry. During that period, Alexander fell in love with Homer's Iliad, which narrates the adventures of Greek heroes during the Trojan War. During their plays, Alexander always wanted to be the hero Achilles, his distant relative. A copy of Homer's work was his traveling companion throughout his life. One day, Leonidas, Alexander's tutor, taught him the significance of honoring the gods and asked Alexander to burn incense in honor of the gods. Alexander took a handful of incense and was reprehended for that.
"What do you think you're doing, boy? This is extremely expensive. When you have conquered the incense-producing kingdoms in Asia, you may use all the incense that you want. But for now, you will burn just one."
As an adult, and after conquering all of Persia, Alexander sent a large incense box to his former tutor with the following message: "I am sending you this large shipment of incense and myrrh, and I hope that, from this day on, you will stop being petty with the gods." After annexing 2 rich gold mines to his empire, Philip II inaugurated a cycle of wealth and prosperity in Macedonia. The Macedonian court started to have access to luxuries never before seen in those lands, and this abundant wealth lured traders from several places in the ancient world. One of those traders was the Greek Philonacus, who was a famous horse dealer in the region of Thessaly. This region was famous for its powerful horses and horsemen. Philonacus offered to Philip a magnificent black horse. It was a huge stallion. Its powerful muscles indicated the magnitude of the animal's strength. Philip loved horses and was interested in the animal. The young Alexander was also there, watching, and memorized by the majestic parade of the black steed. But when they decided to put the harness on the animal, it was untamable. One of the most experienced riders of Philip tried to mount the animal and was thrown to the ground almost immediately. The horse fought the men who tried to tame him, and then Philip said,
"Regardless of how impressive this animal is, if it cannot be mounted, then it's useless for me,"
and dismissed the traitor. At that point, the young Alexander intervened. "No, please, I want it for me."
"Don't you see that even the most skilled riders failed to tame him? It is useless and costs a fortune."
"Father, you cannot lose this invaluable horse just because these men cannot control it. Let me try to mount it, and if I can, it will be mine."
The noble laughed at the audacity of the young prince of Macedon, but Philip noticed a flame burning in the eyes of his son and agreed that he tried. Some of the nobles tried in vain to dissuade Philip of his decision, and mentioned the risk of having the sole heir to the Macedonian throne ending up with his neck shattered due to his attempt. But both Philip and Alexander had already made their decisions. Alexander realized that the animal was extremely ferocious because it was scared of its own shadow on the ground. So the boy slowly approached the animal and touched it slightly, turning it towards the sun. It could no longer see its shadow. When the animal appeared to be calmer, all those around remained quiet, amazed by the scene. Then, Alexander in one move jumped on the horse and firmly held the reins, preventing the horse to fight against him. Little by little, Alexander started to release the reins, allowing the animal to start to walk, and soon they were galloping at full speed, much to the astonishment of those around. As they ran, Alexander felt that he had found a partner for life. When they returned, Alexander received a standing ovation, with those present shouting his name. His proud father ran to embrace his son, who had just come down from the horse, and told him,
Alexander, my son, you must find a kingdom that will do justice to your dimension, as Macedonia is too small for you.
As promised, Alexander received the black horse as a gift. Alexander, noticing a white bull shape on the stallion's forehead, decided to name it Bucephalus. The partnership between Alexander and Bucephalus lasted for almost his entire life. Riding that glorious animal, Alexander would conquer almost the whole known world. The King Philip of Macedon was always seen as a barbarian by the Greeks, and that hurt him. Philip realized that, day by day, the impetuous boy Alexander was becoming more like him, and that his Macedonian tutors, albeit devoted, would not be able to shape the son he had envisioned, and their efforts would just create yet another barbarian Macedonian in the eyes of the Greeks. For that reason, the king spared no efforts to hire the renowned philosopher Aristotle to be responsible for Alexander's formation. Philip ordered the reformation of his palace located in Myesa, which would serve as Aristotle's school, where Alexander and other children of the Macedonian nobility would be educated. Hephaestion, Ptolemy, Seleucus, among others, were some of those students, Alexander's friends. Aristotle taught them lessons in morality, logic, arts, medicine, among several other knowledge. But the great philosopher also lectured exclusive classes for the heir to the throne. Alexander was sometimes stubborn and resistant to studying, which he often considered tedious, but Aristotle was always able to guide him towards the path of virtue, using his persuasion. Why do I have to sit here in the class, while the others spend the afternoon enjoying themselves?
Each one has a place in this world. Unlike you, they were not intended to guide the future of an entire nation. Remember this, education has bitter roots, but its fruits are sweeter than honey.
Aristotle was aware of his pupil's impetus and taught him the importance of a harmonious and balanced life.
Tell me, Alexander, what is the most important virtue for a soldier?
Courage, of course.
Very well. But what happens if a brave warrior decides to abandon his formation and face the enemy's army all by himself?
He'd surely die.
Because bravery in excess does not turn that into an act of courage, rather a reckless act. And so the excess of courage is a vice and not a virtue. But what would happen to that same man if he decided to contain his courage and started to fear too much for his own life?
He'd be a coward.
Precisely. And that is why it is important to always find the middle point. And so, you will find balance.
Alexander had a profound admiration for Aristotle, and for years, he received the best education that a prince could have. Meanwhile, Philip achieved victory after victory, hence expanding the Macedonian Empire. Learning about his father's achievements in the field of battle, Alexander said, "My father is conquering everything in front of him. I'm afraid that nothing will be left for me to conquer when my time comes." Aristotle was aware of the young man's greatness and did the best he could to make him a wise and virtuous man. But Alexander was no longer a child. He was 16 years old, already a man, and his father called him to assume his responsibilities in Pella, the Macedonian capital. Alexander had already reached adulthood, but he still lived with his friends in the Myesa palace, tutored by Aristotle. He shaped him to be much more than a conqueror like his father, turning him into a philosopher king. One day, the arrival of Philip's entourage, the father of Alexander and Lord of Macedonia, is announced. He then addressed Alexander and Aristotle.
Aristotle, thank you for all the work you have done to form a man that no Greek will find a reason to call a barbarian. But now the time has come to deliver him to the world. My lord, I ask you just 1 year more. He still has much to learn. I understand your concern, but the hardness of life is also a teacher with valuable lessons to give.
Alexander went with his father, checking the condition of his army. The young prince was excited. The time to combat alongside his father in the battlefields had finally arrived.
Alexander, I introduce you to the Hetauri, the King's Companions. This is the elite group of the Macedonian cavalry. And now I give you the command of the most feared cavalry regiment in the world.
The companions were comprised of children of the aristocracy and held the positions of greater prestige in the Macedonian army.
Alexander, I want you to understand that our phalanxes are like anvils, and the cavalry is the hammer, which, with their powerful attacks, can tumble any enemy down.
After receiving the command, Alexander is greeted by his new regiment, which comprised a large share of his childhood friends, who were also part of his personal guard. The tensions between the Greeks and Macedonians had reached its limit. The Athenian statesman Demosthenes had mobilized several Greek cities to tackle the Macedonian threat and his barbarian king. Philip decided to go to war. However, the preparations did not occur as Alexander expected.
My son, you will not be able to join me in this campaign because I have a mission for you. You will sit here as the regent of the throne of Macedon during my absence.
But father, I've waited my entire life for this moment. You cannot deny me this. Your secretaries can very well manage the kingdom while you're absent.
I understand your disappointment, but it's vital that everyone knows that my rear is properly protected by someone whom I totally trust, because conspirators are certainly ready to exploit any breach.
Before his departure, Philip gave the royal seal to Alexander. Now, the young prince ruled Macedonia as interim king, and his word was law. Alexander started to deal with the kingdom's administrative matters and had to act as a magistrate. His mother, the Queen Olympias, tried to expand her own power by influencing her son in some decisions. This started to tarnish Alexander's reputation, with people saying that the region of Macedonia was actually ruled by a woman. The Illyrian tribes, a historical enemy of the Macedonians, realized that, with the departure of Philip and his armies, and with a boy on the throne, the perfect moment to attack and weaken Macedonia had come. But they were not ready for Alexander's counterattack. The young ruler gathered all the soldiers who were not with his father and marched to face the army of looters. These were crushed by the Macedonians, and Alexander still conquered part of their territory. There he settled a colony and baptized it with the name Alexandropoli. When he returned to Pella, the capital of the Macedonian Empire, a messenger informed him that King Philip had required his presence in his campaign settlement. The war against the Greeks was not going as planned, and Philip was forced to retreat. "I'm here, father of mine. I became aware of your setback, and that you had to stop your offensive."
My son, we Macedonians are like sheep. We only retreat to hit even stronger. And that is why I called you, because together we will unleash the blow that will end these damned Thebans and Athenians once and for all.
Alexander was finally accomplishing his childhood dream, marching alongside his father in a military campaign. The Macedonian army sailed towards Greece. Several cities and Greek states were joining forces to halt the expansion of the Macedonian Empire's power. An unlikely alliance was formed between Thebans and Athenians, who were enemies. Demosthenes, the most famous Athenian orator and statesman, managed to mobilize part of the Greeks to face the King Philip II of Macedon. Alongside the general Chares, Demosthenes led the Athenian army to join the army of Thebes, which, few years before that, had defeated the mighty Spartan army. And so the Thebans were seen as the best warriors of their era. Much of their reputation was due to the famous sacred band of Thebes. This dreaded band was formed by 150 couples of homosexual soldiers chosen among the best soldiers of Boeotia. These fought side by side with their partners and stood out due to their spirit of camaraderie and unshakable bravery. This band ended the Spartan hegemony, defeating them in the Battle of Electra. The Greek and Macedonian armies were facing each other on the plain of Chaeronea. The Greeks had approximately 35,000 soldiers, whereas the Macedonian had 32,000. Philip II led the right wing of the Macedonian army, which would face the bulk of the Athenian army. Alexander in turn led the cavalry on the left wing, confronting the dreaded sacred band. The fearless Alexander was not intimidated by that risky task, which his father had ordered him to accomplish. The battle began, and the Macedonian army advanced against their enemies. The beginning of the battle was bloody, but the Macedonian phalanxes, although inferior in number, managed to contain the imperial impetus of the Greek phalanxes. Meanwhile, Alexander launched his attack, leading the cavalry of Heteroi against the Greek counterpart. On the right wing, Philip's forces began to cede ground to their enemies, who, feeling the taste of victory, impetuously advanced to attack. Meanwhile, the Sacred Band ripped the lives of those who tried to oppose them. Alexander defeated the enemy cavalry, and now Philip's brilliant strategy could be put into practice. In fact, the retreat of his men had not been a sign of weakness, but a strategy to divide the enemy line. And, seizing that breach, the Macedonian cavalry maneuvered and attacked the Athenian forces from the rear. On the left flank, Alexander readied the attack against the Sacred Band. These stuck their spears on the ground and prepared to withstand the charge, but Alexander and his companions faked a direct attack and just threw their darts. The Thebans used their shields as defense, but most of the shields were now useless, so the Thebans had to fight unprotected. Alexander's cavalry pushed the Thebans directly against the wall of spears of the Macedonian phalanxes. The battle was won. Both Thebans and Athenians fled to save their lives, except for the famous Sacred Band, which fought heroically until the fall of the last man. 2,000 Greek soldiers were killed, including all the soldiers of the Sacred Battalion, and over 4,000 were captured and sold as slaves. Philip's victory was decisive. Both the city of Athens and Thebes were on their knees before the power of the Macedonian army. After defeating the legendary band, Alexander was greeted by soldiers as the hero of the Battle of Chaeronea. Philip II and his son Alexander had forced the Athenians and Thebans to endure a heavy military defeat at the Battle of Chaeronea. Drunk after the celebration of the victory, King Philip literally danced on the corpses of the Greeks who perished on the battlefield. Alexander, seeing that grotesque scene, reprehended his father. "Philip the Barbarian, after all, it seems to me that some criticism made by your Athenian opponents is partially true."
No matter what I do, I will never stop to be seen as a barbarian by those Greeks. But you, my son, you are different. Aristotle actually managed to shape you as a true son of Hellas.
After the Battle of Chaeronea, the city of Athens was virtually defenseless and feared what was about to come next. Alexander entered the city with his entourage and was received with pomp and circumstance. The young man felt marveled by the city. Its splendor surpassed all expectations. There he visited the famous academy where his tutor Aristotle studied with the famous philosopher Plato. He also visited the theater of Dionysius, where the most famous Greek tragedies were staged. And of course, he was amazed when he visited the famous Acropolis and the temple in the honor of the goddess that baptized the city. After his tour of Athens, the young prince addressed the assembly and presented the terms of peace. "My father, King Philip II of Macedon, in a magnanimous gesture, offers you peace. The soldiers made prisoners will return to their wives. The properties and citizens of Athens will be respected, and no Macedonian garrison will remain in your territory. The autonomy of Athens will be preserved. The only condition is that Athens becomes a Macedonian ally." The Athenians were surprised when confronted with such benevolent terms, considering their weak position, and accepted the terms of the alliance treaty. Philip knew the strategic importance of the Athenian navy for his plans, and therefore spared the city that has always fiercely opposed to him. After such a display of strength, the king of the Macedonians required the presence of all Greek cities for an assembly in Corinth. Representatives from every city attended the meeting, except the Spartans. There, Philip, at the height of his power, offered terms to allow the Greeks to live in peace in a large mutual defense alliance led by Macedonia. Philip suggested a great coalition between the Greek cities to take the war to the territory of the historical enemies of the Greeks. the Persian Empire.
The will for revenge against the Persians was present in the hearts of several Greek generations.
People who for a long time waited for the opportunity to return all the evil caused by the Persians during the Greco-Persian Wars. And so Philip was given the title of hegemon. Now, the king of Macedonia was preparing himself to perform a feat as great as those narrated in Homer's Iliad. In the city of Corinth, Philip II of Macedon had just been appointed as the leader of the Pan-Hellenic Alliance, which was a league between the Greek city-states whose intent, among others, was to wage war with their Persian enemies. Philip departed from Macedonia to launch the preparations for his ambitious military campaign. His son Alexander, delighted with the wealth of the Hellenic culture, stayed in Greece for some time. The young Macedonian prince, who had been educated by the famous philosopher Aristotle, learned that the famous thinker Diogenes of Sinope lived in that city. When he was just a boy, Alexander was fascinated with the stories that Aristotle had about Diogenes the Cynic. The eccentric thinker led a life of absolute austerity and detachment from material goods. He lived on the streets and slept inside a barrel. People said that he also had a bowl which he used to drink water, but after seeing a child using his hands as a bowl, he realized that even that was unnecessary. For Diogenes, men began to live artificially, and that separated them even further from true happiness. He spent his days with a lamp looking for an honest man, without ever finding one that he deemed honest. The moment came when Diogenes began to use public spaces as his latrine. When he was reprehended for that, he said that there was no reason to be ashamed of something that is essentially natural to every human being, and that is why he got the epithet of a cynic, a word that originated from the Greek word kainon, which means dog, since the philosopher lived like one. Alexander, learning that Diogenes was close by, asked to be taken to his presence. On the way, one of his men told Alexander,
"Lord, this man is a lunatic."
When Philip's army approached the city, before the surrender of the Greeks, all the people ran to help to strengthen the city walls. Watching that whole scene, Diogenes, like the legendary Sisyphus, began to roll his barrel to the top of a hill, and when he reached the summit, he let the barrel roll back and started all over again.
When he was asked the reason why he was doing such a thing,
he said he felt uncomfortable to see everyone running from one side to the other and decided that he had to do something as well. Alexander found Diogenes laid down on his back, happy and sunbathing. The Macedonian prince stood in front of him and said, "I am Alexander, heir of Macedon and hero of the Battle of Chaeronea. Wise Diogenes, you can ask me whatever you want, and if it is within my reach, I will be happy to give that to you."
Such a beautiful body shape you have, Alexander. You actually look like the incarnation of Apollo himself, like the sun god. Can you give me sunlight?
"I'm sorry, but that I cannot give you."
So, get out of my way, because you're casting a shadow.
Alexander walked away, thoughtful, and his entire entourage couldn't stop laughing at the whole situation. Alexander looked back at him and contemplated the satisfaction of the wise old man as he sunbathed. One of Alexander's friends told him, "That Diogenes is far from sane, don't you think?" And Alexander replied, "If I were not Alexander, I would have wanted to be Diogenes." Alexander was still in Greece when he received a letter from his mother, Queen Olympias of Macedonia. The letter's content was worrisome. King Philip II had divorced for Queen Olympias. The Macedonian nobility never saw her with good eyes since she was a foreigner and worshipper of religious rituals that the Macedonians deemed obscene. Philip would make his young lover, Cleopatra, his new wife, who had the highest pedigree of the noblest Macedonian families. Such a marriage would tie the royal family to all the major Macedonian families in a strong political alliance. A son of such a union would be a great political asset for Philip, but a great threat to the position of Alexander as an heir. After going back to Macedonia, Alexander got the news that Cleopatra was pregnant and that all the preparations for the new royal wedding were already in motion. Olympias filled her son's head with stories about how everyone was conspiring to usurp his future throne. Despite some exaggerations, much of what she said was true. The day of the royal wedding arrived. In order to not discredit his own son, Philip invited Alexander and his mother for the wedding. The feast was filled with drinks, and most of the guests were drunk. The wedding toast was announced. Attalus, who disliked Alexander but was also Philip's faithful friend in general, raised his cup, and looking at the prince, he said,
May the gods bless this union, and let it produce a legitimate heir to the Macedonian throne.
Consumed by anger, Alexander threw his cup against the general and would have started a brawl if he had not been deterred. But apparently, the anger outbreaks ran in the family's blood. Philip, outraged by his son's behavior, drew his sword and advanced against his son. However, he was so drunk that he'd eventually stumbled into one of the armchairs and ended up on the ground. Alexander, pointing his finger to his father, said,
So this is the man who will go from Europe to Asia? How will he do that? He cannot walk from one sofa to the other.
If both had not been stopped in their tracks, a great tragedy could have happened that night. The next morning, the king demanded his son's presence. However, Alexander and Olympias had already departed towards the kingdom of Epirus, where his uncle on the mother's side, also named Alexander, granted asylum. Alexander, after months in exile in Epirus, encountered a messenger from Macedonia. He announced that, due to the birth of Carinus, the youngest prince of Macedon, King Philip had decreed amnesty to all those banished in exile, and so Alexander could return to the Macedonian court without having to fear any backlash. Philip knew the risks of leaving for Asia with a baby as heir to the throne, and therefore Alexander's return was essential for the safety of his plans. In yet another diplomatic move, Philip decided to marry his daughter with his brother-in-law, the King Alexander of Epirus. With this alliance, his position in Europe would be strengthened, and as a bonus, the wedding party would be an excellent excuse to set a grandiose celebration before his departure for Asia. Alexander returned to the court, and in the beginning, it appeared that everything between him and his father had been settled. But his mother, Queen Olympias, did not fail to poison her son's mind against his father and rivals in the court. She even suggested actions that would be considered a true betrayal of the gods and men. Philip had just returned from the Oracle of Delphi, and there he had received the following message.
The bull is ready for slaughter, the end is near, and the slayer is present.
Philip interpreted the message in a positive way. The Persian Empire was going through a civil war, and therefore was vulnerable, and he would assume the role of slayer and subdue the powerful empire. The day of the great wedding celebration had arrived. Dignitaries from across Greece were present to pay tribute to Philip. Alexander and the royal guard were the king's protectors, but he dismissed all the bodyguards and decided to make a triumphant entrance. Alexander insisted to stay behind his father, and the latter told him,
I know that you want to appear by my side as the legitimate heir, but such demonstration is unnecessary. Why would you think that I don't see you as the future king, after having invested so much in you? But for now, leave me alone. This is my time.
Alexander walked away and watched his father enter the tunnel that led to the great theater, where all his guests were waiting. When he appeared on the other side, Philip received a standing ovation from the crowd, and at that moment, he felt like a true god among men. However, one of his bodyguards grabbed a dagger and stuck it deeply on the king's ribs. The murderer ran away, but he was captured and killed by the royal guard. Alexander ran to his father. He, in his last breaths, contemplated his son, looking at him from high above, and before dying, he was sure that the powerful young man, who looked more like a god, would achieve feats that he could never even dream of. While everyone was still perplexed, Ptolemy and Hephaestion, loyal friends of Alexander, shouted,
Hail Alexander!
Long life to the king, Alexander, king of the Macedonians. Oak branches were placed on his head, which were adorned before the now deceased king. With that started the reign of the young man who would one day be known as Alexander the Great.
So as you can see from that video, there's so many great things for us to talk about. The first one being Alexander as a young boy. You saw him coming up through the ranks and getting a lot of different tutors. He had tutors for his physical prowess, for his work on horses, teaching him philosophy, teaching him mathematics, science, making him a very curious boy, both very good physically and in terms of getting ready for warfare, but also just being curious in terms of philosophy and thinking the way that the Greeks did at the time, being the most studious of all the people in Europe. So that was very interesting to see. Then coming up through the nobility, his father being largely away most of the time because he was conquering different lands around Macedonia. So he had most of his time with his tutors and with his mother. His mother was a huge aspect and part of his life in shaping him and making him the young man that he was. It did mention in the videos you saw that when his father did come home at some times in between wars, he would spend time with his son and he would teach him things and he would advise him and he would make sure that the young man was coming up in the way that he saw fit, which was to become the one day king of Macedonia. And so, very interesting there to watch him as he grew and as he matured and came up through the ranks. Then you saw eventually he got the opportunity to come join his father and at his father's side to go to one of the most important battles, which was against several other Greek city-states, as Macedonia continued to try to flex its muscles and to consolidate its gains across Greece and eventually to get all the city-states to join it as allies. So that Macedonia was the leading kingdom in Greece and would unite all the Greeks against the rest of the world. And so he did get his first opportunity there at 18 years old. He led the cavalry on behalf of his father very mightily and in a very brave fashion. And as he led the cavalry, he was probably the most instrumental aspect of that victory against the other Greek city-states to allow his father to consolidate his power. He showed his incredible ability to lead the men in battle, to be the horseman that everyone knew that he could be. His tactics were really incredible for his young age at 18. And he was clearly becoming and shaping into a really great general on the battlefield itself. So pretty cool to see that. And you saw some of the other things he had to face throughout his rise. One of them was that his father divorced his mother and ended up taking a different queen and having a new son come out of that marriage, which was a threat to his taking over as Macedonian king. And so there was a short time there where actually Alexander and his mother had to flee to her kingdom, which was in a different area of the world. And they had to flee there to make sure the two of them would be protected against what looked like was a new kingdom that was forming in Macedonia under his father, King Philip. So his ascension to the throne was very much at risk when it comes to that short period there. Eventually, however, Philip did realize he needed his son. He needed him to come and to work with him to continue to consolidate his gains and to help him back at home to subdue any challengers to his power so that Philip could continue to try to expand his empire. And so he called him and his mother back. They were part of several different ceremonies, as you saw, that took place. And then eventually he was there along with all the other wedding guests to actually see the assassination of Philip II, which several of his bodyguards were behind. This must have been very terrifying and horrifying to him and to the rest of the party, but it did occur in a very public way. And at that event itself, Alexander and his friends were essentially very quickly taking power on behalf of Alexander as the person who was going to ascend to the throne of Macedonia. It's really interesting there, some of the things. Another thing I wanted to mention was, as you saw from the video, Alexander, throughout his entire life, was a little bit different than Philip. He called his father Philip on the battlefield a little bit of a barbarian as he stood and danced on the graves of some of the individuals that he and his troops killed. That really bothered Alexander. He believed in honor. He believed in treating your opponents with dignity and with respect. And so that was a real split between himself and his father in the way that he was going to rule and the way that he wanted to conquer others in other lands and make sure that he did it in a very honorable and did it the right way. So very interesting there when it comes to the video. So hopefully you enjoyed that. You learned a lot about Alexander. You learned about his life. You learned about as he grew up and became a warrior and as he became the greatest conqueror in world history. Ended up creating the largest empire that had ever been seen at the time, took over essentially from Europe through the Middle East and all the way into Asia Minor, including the entirety of the Persian Empire and beyond. So really pretty incredible if you think about the gains that Alexander was able to put together, as you saw there in the video. So let's go ahead and take a look at the 20 interesting facts about Alexander the Great. So you can see a lot of interesting facts there about Alexander you might not have known. The fact that he was an epileptic, the fact that he had a fear of cats. He considered himself the son of Zeus, and he considered himself a cousin to Achilles, one of his great heroes. His favorite book, of course, was Homer's Iliad. He would read it regularly. He even had a version of it put together for him, a shorter version that he could carry with him on his conquests. He also, as you saw there, took over much of the Persian culture as he conquered it, started dressing like Persians, took 2 Persian wives, had Persian children. Some of that really brought a lot of criticism towards him from the Macedonian troops. They really did not want their king to be so Persian, but he believed it was very important, that it was such a huge part of his empire that he assumed some of the cultures so that it would all merge together into one. Some really interesting facts there about Alexander maybe you did not know. Hopefully you find it very interesting and you want to continue to dig into Alexander the Great, his life, his accomplishments, his achievements, the incredible things he did. As you saw, 15 years of conquest that he went through as a young man until he died when he was 32. And he never lost a battle. He was undefeated, which is really pretty incredible. You saw there one of the little known facts was that several of the Roman emperors who really admired Alexander as the greatest general and conqueror of all time actually made pilgrimages to his tomb in Alexandria, Egypt. So that's the kind of notoriety and the kind of respect he had from all the conquerors after him. In a lot of ways, the Roman emperors themselves, as they put together the Roman Empire, looked at Alexander the Great as the model, as the individual who had laid the path ahead of them to create the great Roman Empire. So pretty incredible if you think about that. And the Roman Empire, of course, went on for 1,000 years. So hopefully you enjoyed that. Let's take a quick look at a quick clip of the great movie Alexander, which had some great actors in it, as you'll see.
I've known many great men in my life, but only one Colossus.
A king isn't born, he's made.
What would you do if you ever reached the end of the world?
Never will there be an Alexander like you. Alexander the Great.
Conquer your fear! And I promise you'll conquer death!
The gods have a way of punishing such pride.
No man or woman can be too powerful or too beautiful without disaster befalling.
You never lusted for war, Alexander, or enjoyed it so.
How dare you!
Alexander, be reasonable! You are a name living forever in history.
The king lives! The first rule of war is to do what you ask your men to do.
No one, not my finest enemy, has spoken like you to me!
In my womb I carried my avenger.
I see her in your eyes. Obey me this once!
It takes strong men to rule.
All you desire, the world is yours.
In the end, all that matters is what you've done.
So you can see a little clip of the movie there. It's a really great movie. I would recommend you take a look at it, especially if you're interested in Alexander the Great. The movie does a really good job of showing Alexander as a young boy coming up through his tutors, learning the ways of war, learning the ways of philosophy, of mathematics, getting refined within the court, learning with his friends. And these are friends, several of them, who would stay with him throughout the entirety of his life, become his main generals in his army, always keep his back. In some cases, he would implant them as very large governors of pieces of territory that he conquered throughout his life because he trusted them. But these same set of friends that he learned from Aristotle from would often follow him everywhere he went and be a large part of the leadership of his army. And so that was a big part of his success, is that he had this great group of friends. The movie does a great job visually. It's stunning to watch. The cinematography is fantastic. The acting is really good. The war scenes, if you love war movies, are really fantastic, and they really show kind of how epic and enlarged some of these conflicts were between the Macedonian armies led by Alexander, who, by the way, would be right out front of his men. One of the reasons he had so much success was the respect of his men. He actually would be right out front with them. He would not be behind. Oftentimes he would be facing armies from the Persians or others that were 4 or 5 times larger in numbers. And because of his tactics and his brilliance on the battlefield as a general, he was able to surpass and defeat these much larger armies. So really does give a good sense for that in the movie itself. And it's really a good watch. I'd recommend it. So hopefully you enjoyed this today and learned a lot about Alexander the Great, his history, his rise, the impact he had on civilization in his short life, the Hellenistic culture he brought to so many areas of the world at the time. He really did not just change Europe, the Middle East, or Asia, but he had a humongous impact on all cultures. And he was able to spread a lot of Hellenistic and European ideas, including things like democracy, into many areas of the world. So he had a huge impact on that and on languages and on other aspects of culture. So definitely take a look at Alexander the Great, learn a little bit more about him. There's some great books out as well I'd recommend you check out. And thank you so much for joining us today. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have a lot of great episodes coming your way. We hope you have a great new year, and we'll see you next time on Traveling Through History. Thank you so much.